From kids who showed no remorse after, to teens who about their crimes, these are the most evil teenage boys who've been sentenced to life in prison. Jesse Pomeroy. In December 1874, Suffolk County sentenced the youngest serial unaliver in Massachusetts history to life in prison, Jesse Pomeroy. Also known as the Boston Fiend, the Red Devil, and the Demon, Jesse was born in Charlestown in 1859. He was the second of two sons born to Thomas and Ruth Ann Pomeroy. It's believed that Jesse first started targeting children sometime in 1872, when he was 13 years old. His first victim was a 7-year-old named Tracy Hayden, who was found beaten and unconscious. This was Jesse's pattern, and it continued over the span of a year, where Jesse would lure random young kids, all under the age of 10, beat them, and leave them unconscious in abandoned, isolated locations. By the time he was apprehended in late 1872, Jesse had attacked almost 7 kids. The media referred to him as the Fiendish Boy, based on descriptions the children provided to the police later on. Jesse's believed to have started attacking children after Thomas had abandoned the family, and Ruth Ann moved from Charlestown to Chelsea with her 2 kids. He was eventually caught when the 5th child he'd attacked, Joseph Kennedy, pointed him out to his parents. The police immediately apprehended Jesse, who confessed to his crimes. During his first hearing, the judge sentenced him to 6 years at the State Reform School for Boys in Westborough. But Jesse was paroled back to his mother's home in 1874. To support the family, Ruth Ann had started working as a dressmaker. While many people kept Jesse at arm's length, the family swore up and down that Jesse had become better after his time at the reform school. This changed soon enough when the body of a 4-year-old boy, Horace Millen, was found at Dorchester Bay. The police immediately suspected Jesse of the crime and believed that he was escalating. They arrested him shortly afterwards when the body of a missing 10-year-old Katie Curran was found at Ruth Ann's dress shop. Jesse maintained his innocence, but there was enough evidence against him for the district attorney to argue the maximum possible punishment. He was 14 at the time, and while the jury added a recommendation for mercy on account of his age, the court ultimately sentenced him to be hanged. The only reason his sentence was later commuted to a life behind bars in solitary confinement, the less severe punishment, was because Governor Wilson refused to sign off on the execution order. Jesse was incarcerated at Charleston State Prison at the age of 16, where he spent the majority of his remaining natural life in solitary confinement. Interestingly, he utilized his time well enough to pick up a couple of foreign languages and could speak German with near-perfect accuracy. Psychiatrists were the only ones allowed to visit Jesse in solitary confinement, and they made several notes on his high IQ. They commented on the fact that Jesse had tried and made some very ingenious attempts at escaping prison. He'd also written a few poetry books and tried desperately to have them published. Jesse maintained his innocence throughout and even taught himself law to be able to argue on his own behalf in front of a court and be released. That never happened. The next best thing that lawmakers were willing to offer Jesse was more freedoms within prison, but Jesse rejected the idea. It wasn't until 1917, when he was old and frail, that he accepted his fate and that this was the best he would ever get. In the end, the only time that Jesse got to witness a world outside of Charlestown State Prison was when he was transferred to Bridgewater Hospital for the criminally insane because of his ailing health, where he ultimately passed away at the age of 72. Craig Price. Many believed that Craig Chandler Price knew exactly what he was doing when he committed his crimes, knowing he'd get caught eventually. They believed that it was all a part of his plan to be tried and convicted before he'd turned 16, still a minor. By Rhode Island law, anyone under the age of 16 would be tried as a minor, released by the age of 21, and have their criminal records sealed. In effect, despite the severity of his crimes, Craig was sure that he'd walk away without any repercussions whatsoever. He even bragged about it, claiming that he was on his way to making history. Well, did he? Craig claimed that his motivations for the crimes he committed were racism. He claimed that he'd experienced severe racism in Warwick, Rhode Island, where he grew up, and that fueled a rage inside of him. However, according to several law enforcement officials, Craig likely made that story up to avoid a harsher prison sentence. At the age of 13, in the summer of 1987, Craig broke into a neighbor's home, 2 homes down from his family's residence, and stabbed a woman several times, leading to her unaliving. He then committed the same crime again, 2 years later, at the age of 15, against another neighbor and her 2 minor daughters. The severity of the crimes was unknown at the time of Craig's arrest because of his status as a minor, but after strict opposition from locals, documents were released. Craig was so brutal in his attacks that he would stab his victims long after they'd already passed away. In both cases, law enforcement officials even determined that he was under the influence of drugs. The citizens opposed to the release of Craig Price eventually formed as a group that demanded that Rhode Island change its laws, specifically in this case. To Craig's surprise, lawmakers agreed that a change was necessary. That's when the 15-year-old who boasted about his early release started to sweat. Lawmakers agreed that minors who'd committed gruesome acts, such as in this case, needed to be tried as adults. However, this new law couldn't be applied retroactively to Craig. Even though at the time of his arrest, Craig was determined to be the youngest serial unaliver in American history. But you'd be happy to know that Craig is still in prison. While the courts couldn't sentence the minor to life in prison, Craig guaranteed a life locked up when he committed crimes while being held. These crimes included violating his probation by getting into fights, threatening officers, and refusing to accept orders. At this time, Craig Price is locked up at the Union Correctional Institute in Florida, where he'll remain until 2044. By the time he's released, if ever, he'll be 71 years old. Lionel Tate. Did Lionel Tate commit an unaliving intentional? Or was he mimicking wrestling moves he'd seen on television? That was the question the defense and prosecution had to argue in 1999 when the 12-year-old was being tried for the unaliving of his 6-year-old cousin, Tiffany Unick. Lionel's mother, Kathleen, had been babysitting Tiffany that day and had reportedly left her downstairs with Lionel. The 2 kids started watching WWE SmackDown on television, and that's when Lionel started practicing wrestling moves on his cousin. According to Kathleen, she heard a commotion downstairs and told the kids to be quiet. About 45 minutes later, she claimed that Lionel came upstairs in a panic to tell his mother that Tiffany wasn't breathing. When Kathleen went downstairs, she found Tiffany bruised and bloodied, knocked out cold, and the television still on WWE SmackDown. Tiffany was taken to the hospital immediately, where doctors declared she had passed away. The police took both Kathleen and Lionel into custody, where the 12-year-old admitted that he'd been practicing wrestling moves on Tiffany. This kick-started the trial that would go down in history as a conviction against the youngest unaliver in Florida's history. Reportedly, the prosecution argued that Florida statutes state that Lionel should be tried as an adult for the crime. They argued that he'd intentionally caused harm to the child, knowing that she was in physical harm. They even brought in doctors who testified that the injuries sustained by Tiffany were similar to a child being thrown off a 3-story building. The trial was controversial for several reasons. For starters, the case was never heard by a jury because of Florida's statutes that state any intentional harm caused to a child, even by a juvenile offender, would immediately result in the maximum punishment, life in prison. Then, despite the fact that the prosecution had tried Lionel as an adult and tried him for unaliving, they actually joined in the defense in trying to have him resentenced. This added a whole new layer to the case, and the presiding judge criticized the prosecution for trying him for unaliving in the first place. In January 2004, Lionel was eligible for a retrial on a loophole and sentenced to a year on house arrest and 10 years on probation. Despite his resentencing, Lionel is currently being held at the Hamilton Correctional Institution Annex. Because less than a year later, Lionel was charged with armed burglary, battery, and armed robbery, all in violation of conditions of his parole, obviously. Currently, Lionel is in prison for 30 years and will be eligible for parole in 2036, when he's almost 50. Many believe that Lionel had a second shot at life, and he blew it. Nicholas Browning. Born in 1992, Nicholas grew up in an affluent Cockeysville, Maryland neighborhood. His father, John, was a lawyer and professor. His mother, Tamara, was a homemaker. His brothers, Gregory, 13, and Benjamin, 11, were both students. Nicholas was an honor student, active in lacrosse, and an Eagle Scout candidate. Yet prosecutors said he resented his parents and craved independence. On February 1, 2008, at age 15, Nicholas retrieved his father's handgun while the family was sleeping. Nicholas unalived his parents in their bedroom, unalived his brothers in their beds. Afterward, he met up with friends for the evening, acting as though nothing had happened. The next morning, he called 911, claiming he had found his family. Police quickly became suspicious, and during questioning, Nicholas confessed. He told investigators he had thought about unaliving his father for years and decided to get rid of the whole family to avoid foster care. Prosecutors emphasized the premeditated nature of the murders. The defense cited alleged verbal abuse from his father. In October 2008, Nicholas pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree unaliving to avoid life without parole. In January 2009, he was sentenced to 4 life terms, 2 consecutive, 2 concurrent, with parole eligibility after 23 years. Nicholas will be eligible for parole in 2031, though release is uncertain. Eric Smith. On August 8, 1993, 13-year-old Eric Smith confessed to his mother that he'd committed a horrible crime. His mother, shocked, informed law enforcement immediately, who promptly took Eric into custody. A few months later, a jury found Eric guilty of the horrendous crime and sentenced him to the maximum limit for juveniles in the state of New York. 9 years to life in prison. What was the crime that was so gruesome that Eric's own mother believed that he needed to be locked up immediately for? Well, a few days before confessing to his mother, on August 2nd, Eric was riding his bike to day camp when he spotted 4-year-old Derek Roby. Eric had seen Derek before and knew that they were headed the same way. Derek, who was walking by himself at the time, agreed to take a ride on Eric's bike to day camp. However, Eric took him to the woods where he strangled the young child. He then beat him with a rock before taking off. Eric did horrible things that day, and when investigators found Derek's body after a 4-hour search, they believed that this was an act committed by a sick and twisted adult, only to be left stunned by the fact that it was something that 13-year-old, reportedly timid, Eric Smith had committed. The trial made headlines in the 90s, mostly because Eric was the youngest unaliver in New York's history. Several psychiatrists tried to study his brain functioning to understand what could have led to Eric's crime. They found that he was a loner at school who was often bullied for his appearance. One psychiatrist concluded that Eric had an explosive episode. Another argued that he had ADHD, and a third determined that he was severely depressed. In any case, the jury was unfazed and recommended the maximum sentence for what he'd done to Derek. Eric was sentenced in 1994 and bounced between several prisons and correctional institutions for a while. From 2002 till 2021, he tried several times to be released on parole, arguing that he wouldn't go back to his hometown if released. In 2021, a court finally granted him parole, noting that he'd shown significant remorse for his actions and was on track to get his life back together. While Eric's release was controversial, he was released on parole nonetheless in 2021 at the age of 42, and by 2025 he'd met conditions to end his parole. Evan Miller. Evan Miller's case is notorious both for the brutality of his crime and for changing U.S. juvenile sentencing laws forever. Born in 1988 in Alabama, Evan grew up in poverty with parents who struggled with substance addiction and barely had any time for their son. By his early teens, Evan was experimenting with substances, drinking heavily, and getting into trouble with the law. Everything came to a head on July 15th in 2003, when at just 14 years old, Evan and his 16-year-old friend Colby Smith visited their 52-year-old neighbor Cole Cannon. The three drank alcohol and smoked before an argument reportedly broke out. Evan and Colby got together and attacked Cole, beating him with a baseball bat. It's believed that Evan delivered the final blows, then helped Colby set the trailer on fire, leaving Cole inside to finish the job. Once arrested, Evan was charged with capital unaliving during an arson, and under Alabama law at the time, a conviction carried a mandatory life sentence without parole, even for juveniles back in 2006. His case reached the U.S. Supreme Court as Miller v. Alabama in 2012. The court ruled that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. requiring judges to consider age, background, and potential for rehabilitation. The decision didn't ban such sentences entirely, but made them discretionary rather than automatic. Evan was resentenced in 2017 to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, making him eligible in his mid-40s. Joshua Phillips. Yes, Joshua Phillips had unalived an 8-year-old girl who considered him a friend when he was 14. But was his sentencing fair? That's something that's caused considerable debate over the years. Here are the facts of the case that's divided many. Joshua was born in 1984 in Allentown, Pennsylvania, to Steve and Melissa Phillips. His father has been described as an alcoholic and drug addict who was abusive toward both Joshua and his mother. Steve also imposed strict rules on his son, not letting him play with friends, forbidding him from talking or laughing too loudly, and generally creating an unsafe home for his son and wife. Melissa claimed that Joshua lived in constant fear of Steve, and that the only source of comfort he had was his half-brothers. However, Steve soon relocated the family to Jacksonville, Florida. Here, Joshua is believed to have thrived despite his circumstances. While teachers remarked that he wasn't particularly memorable, he was popular enough and well-liked by everyone. He even made friends in his neighborhood whom he'd play with whenever Steve wasn't around. Madeline and Jessie, her sister, were friends with Joshua. Good friends, actually. The jury viewed a home video shot by Joshua that showed him playing with the sisters, and the defense argued that it showed how Joshua had nothing but love for his friends and the other way around. Then why did he turn around and unalive someone who was supposed to be his friend? Well, in November of 1998, Madeline came over to Joshua's home to play while his parents were out. Steve had a strict rule against his son going out to play or having any friends over whenever his parents weren't home. But Joshua agreed to play baseball with Madeline. At some point, Joshua claimed that the baseball hit Madeline in the eye and she began to cry. He claimed that she was bleeding and crying so hysterically that he panicked. He feared that if Madeline continued to cry, it would cause a commotion and his father would find out he'd disobeyed his rules. This could lead to Steve hurting Joshua. So in that moment, Joshua took Madeline to his home where he knocked her unconscious with a baseball bat. He then waited for his parents to get home, interacted with them for a bit before going back upstairs to deal with Madeline. Joshua claimed that she was still alive, barely, when he went back in. He then proceeded to strangle her before slashing her throat with a knife. Over the course of the following week, Joshua actually participated in the search to find Madeline, claiming that he wasn't doing it to avert suspicion, but that he was genuinely in denial over the whole incident. It wasn't until a few days later, when Melissa found Madeline's body while cleaning her son's room, that she informed the police immediately. Joshua was arrested later that day at his school and confessed. Despite his version of events and public opinion being divided over whether he should or shouldn't be given the maximum for the crime, Joshua was tried as an adult. The next controversial aspect in Joshua's case came during his 2-day trial, where his lawyer reportedly refused to allow any witnesses to testify on his client's behalf. He even refused to allow Joshua to speak on the stand and didn't discuss the case with him whenever he visited him in prison. Ultimately, the jury found Joshua guilty of first-degree unaliving and recommended the maximum sentence, life in prison. Joshua has been held at the Cross City Correctional Institute since 2024 and has been remarked as a model prisoner. He's completed his GED behind bars, works as a paralegal, and has helped other inmates with their legal matters, and even plays for a Christian band in lockup. While Melissa Phillips has tried to get her son out of prison by way of resentencing, Madeline's mother, Sheila Clifton, has stated that she believes Joshua should never be released. Michael Hernandez. Michael Hernandez's case remains one of the most disturbing examples of premeditated unaliving committed by a teenager. Born in 1989 in Miami, Florida, Michael appeared to be an ordinary middle school student at Southwood Middle School. In reality, he harbored a fascination with serial unalivers and had compiled a detailed unaliving list that included classmates, his sister, and, first on the list, his best friend, Jaime Goof. In February of 2004, at just 14 years old, Michael put his plan into action. He smuggled a knife and gloves into school, lured Jaime into a locked bathroom, and launched a calculated attack. Jaime was stabbed over 40 times, his throat slashed in what investigators described as an execution-style unaliving. When questioned, Michael confessed without hesitation, calmly explaining his interest in unaliving and the planning that had gone into the crime. Police later found his written plans at home, detailing how he wanted to do the same to multiple people in order. Tried as an adult, Michael was convicted of first-degree unaliving in 2008 and sentenced to life in prison without parole. His case became a flashpoint in debates over juvenile sentencing and whether young offenders with such violent tendencies could ever be rehabilitated. A re-sentencing hearing in 2016 reaffirmed his life sentence. But then, on April 29, 2021, Michael passed away suddenly in prison at the age of 31 from a suspected cardiac condition. Kip Kinkle. Kip Kinkle is remembered for committing one of the most shocking school shootings in United States history. Born in Springfield, Oregon, Kip was the youngest child of two well-respected Spanish teachers. Struggling with dyslexia, social isolation, and behavioral issues, he grew increasingly and terrifyingly fascinated with guns and explosives. By his mid-teens, he was collecting firearms and obsessively reading about mass shootings, while also showing signs of severe mental illness, later diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenia. On May 20, 1998, Kip was suspended from Thurston High School after being caught with a stolen handgun. Arrested and released to his parents, he returned home and, later that day, shot his father as he came in from work, then unalived his mother that evening. The next morning, Kip drove to school with multiple guns and over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Entering the cafeteria, he opened fire, unaliving 2 students and injuring 25 others. His rampage ended when several brave students tackled him to the ground, knocking the weapons out of his hand. In custody, Kip claimed he didn't understand why he had unalived his parents, though he admitted to hearing voices urging violence. In 1999, he pleaded guilty to 4 counts of unaliving and 26 counts of attempted unaliving. He received a 100-year prison sentence without the possibility of parole. Alec Crider. Alec Crider's case is remembered for its brutality and betrayal. Born in 1990 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, Alec appeared to have a stable life, attending Manheim Township High School and coming from a supportive family. But then, on May 12, 2007, at age 16, Alec entered the home of his close friend Kevin Haynes while the family was asleep. Unprompted, he stabbed Kevin multiple times, and when the kids' parents, Thomas and Lisa Haynes, rushed to help, Alec attacked them as well. Kevin's sister, Maggie, managed to escape through a window and called for help, becoming the sole survivor in her entire family. Initially, police had no suspect, as Maggie never saw Alec, and he returned to school the next day, acting like everything was normal. The case broke when his father reported that Alec had confessed. In custody, he admitted to the unalivings and claimed he had no remorse. Alec described a long-standing desire to unalive someone. Kevin and his family were chosen at random. In June 2008, Alec pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree unalivings, avoiding the maximum penalty. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without parole. On January 20, 2017, at age 26, Alec passed away in his cell at SCI Camp Hill after a decade in prison.